Hi, this is Loci from Beta Folders. In today's video, we'll take a look at the selection interface in Foldit and why you should not be afraid of it. As a companion to today's video, there's a new web page on the wiki site, foldit.wiki.com, called Selection Interface, and that'll give you much more information on the topics that we'll discuss today. To get started with the selection interface, here in the original interface, go to Menu and click on Selection Interface. That takes you to the new selection interface. You can get back to the original interface quickly simply by typing 1 on the keyboard as a keyboard shortcut or hotkey. So 1 takes you back to the original interface. We can go to the selection interface again. Now, one of the first things that you'll notice is the menu bar is gone from the bottom of the screen here, and instead you have some folded tools and this folded icon in the lower left-hand corner. And if you click on that icon, you'll see that the options from the menu bar are now arranged vertically instead of horizontally, and they have big icons. So if you click on P here, that'll bring up a floating window, and that has the options that you're familiar with from the main menu in the original interface. And the same is true for the other windows, such as View Options, Behavior, and the Cookbook. They're all floating windows in the selection interface. And all of these floating windows have keyboard shortcuts. For example, if you just type a P, that's a lowercase p, you get the main menu. And even though Behavior does not have a keyboard shortcut shown, if you type B, you do get Behavior, and that's a floating window. And you can type V for View Options, and that's a floating window too. So all the options that you're familiar with in the original interface are really just in a slightly different location in the selection interface. Now you have these tools across the bottom of the window, and those vary depending on what you have selected, which segments you have selected in the selection interface. So let's take a quick look at how to select segments. To select one segment, I just left-click on that segment, and it's selected, and the number of segments selected is reflected up here in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Now to select more segments, I can just locate another segment that I want selected, and I can hold down the Shift key, and all segments between the first selection and that segment will be selected for me. So now I have 13 segments selected. And so now the icons across the bottom of the screen have changed their appearance a little bit. For example, the wiggle tool no longer has the word all there, and that's reflecting the fact that it'll only work on the selected segments, leave the rest of the protein alone. So now I have a clash here, so I might want to shake these selected segments a little bit to see if I can get rid of that clash. And you can see that the clash has cleared up, but clashes that are farther down in the protein are still there. So that's one thing that you can do very easily in the selection interface that you can only do using a recipe in the original interface, and that is apply a tool to just part of the protein. Another way to select multiple segments in the selection interface is to double-click on a secondary structure like a helix or a sheet. So when I do that, the entire secondary structure is selected, and also all the loop segments that connect that secondary structure to the next one are selected as well. And again, I can shake, and will affect just those selected segments. Now it works a little bit differently when I select loop segments, so let's zoom in here. If I double-click on the loop segments between two sheets, for example, only those loop segments are selected, and the secondary structures on either side are not selected. But that brings us to another tool. With just two segments selected, two adjacent segments I should say, we can use the Cut tool, or the C keyboard shortcut, to insert a cut point. And that puts a cut between these two sheets. And then we can use the Move tool, which works in almost the same way as in the original interface. So to use the Move tool, let's first select a segment, and then we'll select the Move tool here from the tools available at the bottom of the window, or I like to just use the 3 keyboard shortcut. And that allows me to rotate the area containing the selection. And I can hold down the Control key, hover over the Move tool, and drag to move the area containing the selection. Or I can hover over the Move tool and drag with the right mouse button to move the selection as well. So that's very similar to how the Move tool works in the original interface. Now, if you don't have anything selected, the Move tool is displayed, but it really doesn't do anything that just dragging on the background won't do. So, as a tip, you may want to hide the Move tool when you're not actively using it. Now, through the magic of television, let's take a look at some other features in the selection interface. And we'll assume that we've already moved these 2 sheets into approximate alignment. So at this point in the proceeding, you might want to try to put in some bands. And so the way you do that in the selection interface is using a right mouse click and drag. So before we do that, let's look at the view options. We'll hide the exposed and the voids. We'll say don't show, and we'll unclick show side chains with clashes or exposed. And that makes things just a little bit less cluttered, but we can still see where the problem clashes are. To create bands in the selection interface, just right-click on a segment and drag. And oops, as you can see there, it's easy to create frozen segments when you're doing this, because right-clicking on a segment in the selection interface freezes that segment. But again, we'll just continue drawing some bands here in an attempt to hold these 2 sheets together. So now what we can do is select this entire section containing the 2 sheets, and let's just shake that section to see if we can clear up some of these clashes. And that does indeed make the clashes go away. Then we might apply the Wiggle Side Chains tool for just a few cycles, and that again might help with the positioning of the side chains. And probably the next step would be just to select the loops on either side of your open cut point and wiggle just that part a little bit. And that creates some clashing, but that clashing resolves itself. And that allows us to close the cut point just by clicking on the cut point. And then again, we can shake that entire section with the 2 sheets, wiggle side chains for a moment. So that's a quick demonstration of banding in the selection interface. And we'll use the R keyboard shortcut, or this icon, to release all our bands. Let's look at freezing just a little bit more. As we saw, right-clicking on a segment freezes that segment. Right-clicking again unfreezes that segment. Just like selecting a secondary structure, if you double right-click on a secondary structure, you freeze that entire secondary structure. But unlike selecting a secondary structure, this does not select the loops at either end of the secondary structure. It just selects the structure itself. And you can unfreeze either by double-clicking again or just using the F keyboard shortcut. And if you double-click on a loop, that freezes just the loop. And as you may have noticed, the timing of the double click can be a little bit tricky. And if you have the Move tool enabled on a segment, that can make it even trickier still. So usually it's better to hide the Move tool, because that can create problems. One other way to select multiple segments in Foldit is the Sphere Select feature. You'll see that mentioned up here in the upper left-hand corner. So if I click on a segment and hold Control plus Shift, that gradually selects more segments as I drag the mouse pointer down the window. And if I drag the mouse pointer back up the window, fewer segments are selected until we end up with just that original 1 segment selected again. And it's hard to see in this example, but that's gradually selecting all segments that are within a certain radius of the first segment selected. So when you have more of a 3-dimensional structure of the protein versus just a flat structure here, that becomes much more evident. So that's just another example of something that's easy to do in the selection interface that you really can't do at all in the original interface without using a recipe. So that's all for today. Again, the selection interface makes it possible to do many things manually that you would require a recipe to do in the original interface. There are some annoying things in the selection interface, such as accidentally freezing segments when you're trying to draw a band, but those really aren't too bad, and you can always switch back to the original interface quickly if you get tired of dealing with those issues. So that's it for the moment. Hope this helps, and keep on folding.